Yeah, no, I get to do that occasionally. Okay, we're in 2 Samuel 14. We have a few things to discuss still in this chapter, and then we will go on to chapter 15. Chapter 14, remember we saw this scheme of Joab's to get David to understand that he really should bring Absalom back in. Now, we talked about Joab's probable motivations for that. I don't think we need anything nefarious, really. That he probably does mean well, although we also noted a lot of the differences between, how Joab was trying to get David to think less seriously about the severity of that sin versus Nathan's, on the surface, similar strategy of using that surprise parable, but trying to get David to be even more upset about the sin that he had been overlooking. And so really this is a little misguided on Joab's part, probably to put that lightly. But David finally sees, he understands that this comes from Joab once a woman reveals that her situation is not real and that this is, her attempt to get him to bring Absalom back. He says, don't lie to me, don't hold back anything from me. Is this Joab? And that, I think, there tells us how much there had been previous talk about this, that Joab had been trying to convince David to bring Absalom back, which makes logical sense anyway. What would an advisor, a commander that has the trust of David try first? An elaborate scheme or just talking to him? Surely they talked first. Surely Joab made his case many times before, but David was reluctant. So now that David knows this is Joab and he's brought Joab to him, what is David's judgment of Absalom? Okay, yeah, it says, bring him back. He's allowed to come back. This is the first time in this story so far that we've seen David take any actual direct action toward Absalom. Remember, the only reason why Absalom was in exile was because Absalom ran off, not because David was necessarily doing anything, but because Absalom feared that something would happen. So now David is finally actively doing something. But what is the other condition of this? Yeah. So he can come back, he can live, in his own home, he can live in the city, but I don't want to see him. Don't let him come into my presence. So everything is not well between David and Absalom, clearly. But David still understands, from Joab's point of view, why it might be a good idea to have Absalom back in the city, not in exile. The idea, like we talked about last week, is hopefully this will take away any crisis if David suddenly dies, and hopefully this will stop Absalom from starting his own rebellion. I realize it's a little ironic, considering he's going to start his own rebellion in the next chapter, but hey, hindsight is 20/20. So that's David's judgment of Absalom. He gets to come back, but he doesn't get to see David. And this happens for some time. Let's see, what do we learn about Absalom at the end of this chapter, kind of from 25 on down? Aaron. Yeah. So we see some passage of time happening here. and Absalom kind of resuming a place in society. He has children. I do find it interesting that he names one after Tamar, his sister, which is, a nice thing for him to do. Yeah, Jeff. Yeah. This certainly is not much of a portrait of forgiveness, really. And I'd argue that David hasn't, well, like you're saying, hasn't really forgiven Absalom here. This seems like more of a weak moment on his part, that he still is conflicted, still pulled between the multiple feelings on the subject. I think there's still guilt here, because he knows that Absalom is worthy of punishment, and he has not, dealt any punishment out. So he can't have things be completely normal. He can't have Absalom come into his presence and act like, oh, we're just dad and son again. But he also doesn't want Absalom to be completely estranged and to live in exile. So caught between the two is very difficult. Aaron?
Yeah, verse 21, when David decides to bring Absalom back, he said, bring the young man Absalom. It's interesting. He doesn't say, bring my son.
Yeah.
He says, bring the young man.
Yeah, I noticed that too. That's a little removed. That's not how you imagine the father-son reunion, and hey, there's not really a reunion here, so that kind of fits. It's bring him back, bring that young man back. He can be in town, he can be in his house, but not in mine. Things are really still not right. And surely there will be no consequences to all of that in the very next chapter. Okay, so we learned as well about Absalom in verse 25 that no one so much. There was no one so much to be praised for his handsome appearance as Absalom. This is kind of foreshadowing a little bit of how Absalom is going to get the people on his side and how he's going to attract so much popularity. This wouldn't really be enough all by itself. It's just kind of an interesting note about him, that he is handsome and good looking. But combine that with what we're going to see in the next chapter, and you'll see that he quickly starts building popularity. And then, as Aaron mentioned before, Absalom lives 2 years there in Jerusalem. We have time passing. But in 2 whole years, he doesn't see his father. He doesn't see David. David has not wavered in this. Or if he's wavering in his mind, he has not fully changed his mind to let it happen. And so Absalom sent for Joab on multiple occasions, but Joab won't even go see him. Joab seems to understand that this is a complicated situation, and he doesn't really want to go see Absalom because he doesn't have a good answer to give him. So then Aaron, slightly tongue-in-cheek, said that Absalom got Joab's attention. How did he get Joab's attention? That's one way to do it. He set his field on fire. And yes, that will get Joab's attention. So he sends his servants over there. So Joab's field is next to Absalom's, apparently, and they set it on fire. And Joab comes to Absalom, finally, directly, and basically says, what gives? Like, what are you doing, and what do you want? And Absalom's answer is, I've been calling for you. I've been asking for you. And I want you to send this message to the king saying, why am I even back here? Why did you have me come back out of exile? It is worse for me to be here and to not be back in the full relationship and full forgiveness and everything. It really is better for me to still be in exile. And he says, I want to see David. I want to see the king. If there is guilt in me, let him put me to death. So things are going to come to a head. How does that end? When Absalom finally sees David? I heard a whisper, but I don't know who it came from. Yeah, what does that mean? Yeah. He didn't put him to death, right? So that there is a resolution here. It's kind of understated. We don't get a big, movie scene to see how they come back together. But basically, David accepts Absalom back, and so everything is good again. Or so we think. Yeah. And several of you have interesting looks on your faces as I say that, because it, of course, is more complicated than that. Absalom has not forgotten all the things that have caused him hurt. He has not forgotten how Amnon did this to Tamar and how David did nothing about it. He's not forgotten those years that he was in exile. He's not forgotten the 2 years that his father didn't want to see him. He has not forgotten how sin has corrupted him. Because if you're resorting to things like setting someone's field on fire to get their attention, well, maybe there's an anger problem. Maybe there's a violence problem in your life. And we've already seen Absalom get very good at holding on to his anger and letting that build and build and build until it overflows. In the case of Amnon, it was with murder. In the case of Joab, it was with, let's set his field on fire. Okay. Anything else through chapter 14? Yeah, and that's they're reconciled now. Everything seems to be good. There seems to be forgiveness here. Jeff, go ahead.
Yeah, it doesn't seem like, it doesn't say when his daughter was born.
Mm-hmm.
I'm assuming that it was after Tamar's rape. So, it sounds to me, it seems to me that anyway that he's putting it constantly in the forefront.
Yeah, I think so too. The fact that it doesn't name the sons here, but it names the daughter here in our narrative. Right. Yeah, I don't think it's an accident that that name is highlighted here right after we had the story of Amnon and Tamar. So, yeah, this is, if we knew nothing else about Absalom, you could say, well, this is a nice thing that he did for his sister who's living with him until she dies. She's lived as a broken woman. He's giving her, a niece named after her that she can see life in. Okay, that could be a good thing. But I suspect that you're right, Jeff, that this is more indicative of Absalom holding on to this anger and keeping this very much in the forefront of his mind, that he is going to resolve things in a way that he wants to see them resolved. So he was angry at Amnon and he killed him. He, I think, is still angry at his father for not doing anything about it. And that's going to be part of his motivation for the events of chapter 15. Yeah, Mark.
Yeah.
I think it's
protagonist that you want to win
Yeah.
because he's a good guy.
Okay, so I agree with you in principle, but I think that this might be here for a different reason than that, the way that I read it. Because I would argue that David's forgiveness of Absalom here is actually still a failure, which is maybe a hard thing for us to see. We say, well, okay, David was forgiven of his grievous sin, and yes, he was. But like he showed his repentance, he showed his humility, he showed that he wanted to be right with God. We've not seen a whole lot from Absalom. We do see him say, if there's guilt in me, let me be put to death. That's the most we've seen out of Absalom there. But I would argue this is tied more to David's inaction and tied more to his refusal to discipline his sons, which, he didn't do it with Amnon. He's not done it with Absalom. There's been no justice in this. That this is building up to the events of chapter 15, not just as a random thing that happened, and not just as Absalom starting a rebellion because he's not that great of a guy, but I think we can make an argument from chapter 15 that this is also a punishment from God on David for his actions, his inactivity in this, and part of the punishment for the sin that he had with Bathsheba. Now, I realize I've made several claims in this here that we need to back up. I want keep that in your mind and see if you agree with me as we go. The way things play out in chapter 15, I think will help to bolster that. But I still agree with you in principle, Mark, that that's very much a goal of this narrative, to get us to like David, to get us to see that he generally wants to do what is right, and he is generally a likable, heroic sort of character in this. And even if, as I would argue, that David is failing here, he's failing in a way that is still sympathetic to us, that we can be sympathetic toward. That I can see how messy this situation is for David and empathize that he doesn't have a lot of good options here, that he is living with the consequences of his sins, and he doesn't know the best way to handle this. Or maybe he does know, but he's not really willing to do it. We get boxed in like this sometimes, and we don't know exactly what to do about it. So there's a lot of empathy in this, and I really do feel for David. He is a very likable character in this. I don't say character like he's fictional, but character in a narrative. But still, try to follow me and see if you agree as we go, that we can still argue that this is a failure. Aaron?
I look at this as just being very practical to the way that the story unfolds.
Yeah.
Like, this is a necessity for Absalom to take the next steps. Like, immediately after this, he goes and gets chariots and horses and 50 men to run before him.
Yeah.
Well, he couldn't have done that if he wasn't back in David's graces.
Yeah.
So he gets his father's forgiveness, and then he starts taking advantage of being a son of the king.
Yeah. So if he had still been in exile, would Absalom have started a rebellion? Maybe, maybe not, but it's an impossible thing to answer. Seems like probably he would have at least wanted to. It would have had to happen differently than it did here. The exact way that he does it would not have been possible from exile, that's for sure. David and Joab are trying to make it where Absalom can't or doesn't want to start his own rebellion because now he's back in Jerusalem. Unfortunately, that's not really stopped him, right? He can do it from Jerusalem, and we'll see how that unfolds. Ida?
This might be obvious, but David was king.
Yeah.
And the government holds his sword. And the government has the responsibility to carry out justice. And maybe this is just another weakness of having a king that's not a perfect king. Because instead of doing what he
I think that's the argument to be made from this, that David should, I have trouble reading this any other way than David should have put Absalom to death. That was the proper punishment for premeditated murder, done very boldly with the high hand, and it gets complicated by the fact that he's family. And that is human nature, that we have a harder time doling out those sorts of judgments against family. You see it in churches sometimes where when there are lots of family relationships in a church, it can make church discipline difficult. It can make sometimes elders have a hard time in talking to their own family in a way that, your even extended family, in a way that they might not have a hard time talking to someone else. It shouldn't be that way, but human nature tells us that it can be that way, and we have to guard against that. David has a weakness here, that he has shown so much good justice and good sense in most of what he has done, but with his family, there really is trouble.
I think it's interesting because I've been pondering this. There's a number of characters in the Bible that had trouble with family. And so, even though it's a horrible thing, it shouldn't surprise us nowadays when we have trouble with the next generation, or as you say, the elders have trouble with that, it is human nature, and we need to be aware of that.
Yeah, it is. That can make it very difficult. And often what is simple in general becomes very complicated when it gets in, dealing with our own families, right? So we see that in a lot of different ways. Jeff and then Betty?
Yeah, I see maybe David's guilt coming constantly before him, because just 2 chapters before, David told him, your family's going, you put the shame on, reproach on Israel. There's going to be problems with your family. Rise up in your family, and all those different things. It's like, so as these things are happening, and I can see David, thinking back, if I only hadn't done that before, maybe things would be different now.
Yeah. Yeah, David's family is a lot more complicated than I'm sure he would like. And that was listed as one of the punishments against him for his sin with Bathsheba. So, yeah. Okay, Betty?
Well, if David had dealt with Amnon to begin with, and punished him, then Absalom, wouldn't have happened to sin, It's kind of, it just keeps cascading down.
Right. Yeah. So I mentioned this last week. This is. Let's say this again because this is really important. I think that's one of the lessons from this whole extended narrative is that the problems with, the problem with Amnon in raping Tamar either wouldn't have happened or would have been easier for David to deal with had he not sinned with Bathsheba. Okay? And then the problem with Absalom would not have happened if David had dealt with Amnon. Well, then the rebellion would not have happened if he had dealt with Absalom. And so you see, you have this whole chain of events that started with one thing to satisfy his own desire and pleasure, which seems so simple, so easy, so, just like a small thing, that has spiraled into a very large problem for David, for his whole family, for the entire nation. There are ripple effects to sin, and sometimes they're very dramatic like this, and sometimes they take a long time to play out. This, happens over years. But there are things that we do, sins that we commit, that have long-lasting impacts on ourselves, on our children, on the people around us, on the church, and we don't even always see how those things ripple out. Very important to recognize that sin needs to be avoided And when there is sin, it needs to be dealt with very quickly to try to limit this collateral damage.
With all these things that David's done, evil things that he's done, or hasn't corrected and stuff like that, one thing we gotta keep in mind is, God said, he's a man after my own heart. I mean, he's one of those people who's seeking God. So even though, and that's encouraging to us, because we might think, hey, there's no way I can be pleasing to God, but we're trying to be pleasing to God, even though we've sinned against Him. We can still be forgiven. If we're seeking God.
Yeah, it's a good thing for us to remember that David, as a man after God's own heart, was certainly not perfect. And I think as we're going through this whole story of David, we're able to recognize that it's more than just, oh yeah, he had that one time with Bathsheba. David's life is as complicated and messy as ours are. David is not called a man after God's own heart because he had so much less sin, so much less temptation he dealt with, or lived so much closer to perfection than most people do. David's called a man after God's own heart because he keeps coming back to God. As he sins and as he makes a mess of his life, he keeps turning back to God for forgiveness and for this to be cleaned up. He wants his heart to be pure, and you can see that in how these events play out, and you can see that really in the Psalms especially. There's a lot of Psalms where David shows his grief over his sin and his desire to trust in God, to be made pure by God. That when David says that his hands are clean before God, which he does multiple times in the Psalms, that's not because he's saying, I've lived so perfectly. It's because he trusts in God's ability and willingness to forgive him, which God has done again and again. Mark?
Yeah, I think, you wonder if David understands what Jeff is saying, that God told him this was going to happen. The sword was not going to leave his house. And maybe he's just thinking, God, this is God's doing. I can't undo this. We don't know. You're
We don't
not
know.
told what he's thinking.
Yeah.
But I would say, what a great blessing it is to be a Christian.
Yeah.
Because David sees this sin, and he's seeing that it hamstrings him, essentially, from doing anything. And for the Christian has the ability to say, I know what to say about this sin because I had it in my life.
Yeah.
And I can tell you that it's not going to go well. And the Christian understands that once that devotion to God is there, that there's redemption, there's a place to come back to Him through the Christ. David didn't have that, and we just see the contrast between back then and what God has afforded us today. Not that we're prideful in our sin, but that we can warn other people.
Yeah.
I see the issues that
Yeah.
be in your life because of these things.
Yeah, we give all glory to God for what we have in the new covenant with him, and even our better understanding of what God's plan is for us and that fullness of forgiveness that we have. And that the problem of sin is well and thoroughly dealt with, that it can be eradicated and its effects destroyed. Yeah, say it.
Jeff was talking about how David was, and give up on God and willingly confess his sin. But his sin is a sin of omission, which is, he's not performing certain action. And that's something I've been struggling with. I talked about that with God.
That's a good point you brought up here, that now we're dealing with more of David's sins of omission here. Like, I think some number of us would look at David's sin with Bathsheba and just go, man, David, like, what are you doing here? That's such an absurd thing to do. And maybe even feel a little good about yourself. You know, I would never do something so dramatically evil like that. So obviously sinful. You know, we might question that anyway, whether we can be quite so bold about that. But okay, let's even grant that for a moment. What about these sins of omission? Those, a lot of times, are harder for us because it's not about that big, bold, sinful action that you're taking, that you decided to do. It's what you didn't do. It's what you held back in that needed to be done. And David's problem in these chapters has mostly been what he's not doing, what he is refusing to take action in. And so a lot of us can, I think, empathize with this and can see things in our own lives that we have not taken action in that we should have. And so it's good to see that David can even be forgiven of this, and that does not have to shipwreck his faith or his relationship with God. But we can also see how serious these stakes are. You can do just as much damage by failing to do something that you need to do as you can by overtly and directly doing something that is evil. So let that be a lesson for us. Lito?
Yeah, I think you're right about that. Word that we have to do something. Comparing David to Paul, can you weigh anything? Can you distinguish which is more way? Paul being a Christian, not a Christian, but doing something against the will of God before, but doing something after he was called out is something that we need as well as an example.
Yeah.
Because without doing anything after the sin is the biggest thing in one's life.
Yeah. So I think it says something that if, I were to ask any person who reasonably knows the Bible, any of you, if you were to ask me, I think I'd give the same answer. If you had the question, name a time that David sinned, the thing that comes to everyone's mind is, David and Bathsheba. I'm like, of course that is a correct answer there, and maybe the one that looms largest, but it is not the only time that he sinned, and it's maybe not even the most damaging thing that he did, though, I don't know, you could probably make a pretty good argument that it is. This, not addressing Amnon's sin in raping Tamar, not addressing Absalom's sin in murdering Amnon, there are problems there, and that's sin for David, both in his role as father and his role as king. You get two layers to this, that he has not dealt with those sins in his own family and his own nation.
Well, the first part of chapter 15 here, where Absalom steals people's hearts,
Yeah.
we see David possibly not acting there either, because how can he's the king. He should know everything that's going on in his kingdom. How can he not see his son, Absalom, sitting there doing, counsel to the people and stuff like that, and not take any action?
Yeah, you do wonder, right? Again, in a narrative that has been about David's inactivity, is that a fair assessment then to say that David is being inactive here and should have known better? I think you might be right, All by itself, you might say, well, David just didn't know. Absalom hid it really well. I don't know if he hid it really well. He's doing it kind of openly and in public. And again, the whole theme of this has been David's inactivity. So we don't know exactly what David knew, but it doesn't look good for him, and there are going to be consequences. So let's talk about what exactly does Absalom do to undermine David's rule here at the beginning of chapter 15. There's a few things. Yeah.
When he directs the people, he sends out front. It's like, you're wanting to see the king for judgment. Hey, don't bother with the king. I'll take care of it for
Yeah, so he's going out each morning, out to the gate and kind of intercepting these people who are coming to bring a matter before the king. And he, is kind of that first layer where he says, explain your case to me. And they do, and they say, oh, well, Absalom says, you've got a good case there. If only there were someone to hear it. The king hasn't designated anyone to hear your matter. Kind of a veiled way, maybe not even so veiled, just a way of saying, David's not all that interested in justice. David isn't doing his job. He's failing in his duties. And verse 4, oh, that I were judge in the land. If I had the authority, then I would give justice. And yeah, we can see right through what he's doing here. He's undermining David's authority and elevating his own. And we see that grow as well, that he starts more openly acting like judge and ruler, that people are coming to pay homage to him. He's putting out his hand and taking hold of them and kissing them, that kind of greeting like someone coming into a court of a king. He is acting a lot like a king. And then what Aaron mentioned earlier of him getting the chariot and horses and this detachment of 50 men to escort him, this is the sort of thing that you only saw a king do in Israel. The chariot and horses, that's the weapons of war, obviously, and sometimes others would use those in battle. But outside of battle especially, that's a little bit like me making a presidential motorcade for myself. It has implications, right? That, I've got the big black limo and all, armed guards around me, and I send people out to stop traffic. Like, that's odd. People don't just do that. And if you combine that with me trying to act like the president, then, well, now that's even worse. And then if if I were the son of the ruler, the son of the president, or in this case, son of the king, it looks even worse. Jeff?
Well, he's also, the Bible through here says how good looking Absalom is.
Right.
And people, they were drawn after Saul. Hey, Saul's been shoulders above everybody. People, it's like, hey, this is a good looking guy, and he's on my side and stuff like that. He's drawing people toward him, and people tend to follow looks, actions, and stuff like that.
Yeah. Yeah, now that simple statement that was given in chapter 14 seems more sinister, right? Like, it's one thing to say, oh, he's good looking, but now combined with him trying to build popularity, that means just a little bit more. I want to point out something here that's very important. This is a difference between a Hebrew idiom and an English idiom that's going to dramatically change your understanding of one of these verses. Verse 6 at the end says, so Absalom stole the hearts of the men of Israel. So we use the phrase, stole our hearts, or, Lauren stole my heart, so I fell in love with her. Or, this person stole the hearts of America, and, we all fell in love with this, talented person on there. We use it to mean usually something good, usually something that, well, we've kind of fallen in love, whether it's romantic love or just that adoration of somebody that's, made America go all starry-eyed, right? That's not what the idiom means in Hebrew. Like, literally the words are the same, stole the hearts, but that's used in much more of a deceptive tone in Hebrew. The emphasis being on stealing. That Absalom is pulling a fast one on people. He is pulling the wool over their eyes and stealing them away from where they rightfully ought to be. And that fits much better with his actions here, that he's intercepting people who are going to David. He is pretending like David is not going to execute justice in the land, when we have no indication that David's not going to do that, and anything not to do with his family, David has been a good ruler and a good king. But Absalom wants to make it appear that David is not a good king, and that he is a more fit king. Dave?
Well, I find this completely ironic. Absalom, he's conspiring against David, period. You can't shake and make it any other way.
Yeah.
Because we read on how he sent spies in the land and all this stuff. I mean, then pronounced I'm king and all this. He wanted the throne. But the ironic thing to me is him to say to the people, oh, if I were made a judge, I would serve justice. If David had to serve justice, Absalom wouldn't have been sitting there talking.
Right.
Dead.
Right.
Okay, so it's really ironic him to twist around and use things to benefit himself. And I know David forgave him, and he ended up going before David at the end of the chapter there,
Yep.
and he kissed him and he forgave him. No argument that David was not doing what he should have been doing, but it doesn't make it right to conspire against what God has
Yeah.
in front of us to obey and all those things. So you can't have it both ways. You don't
Yeah.
decide. We don't get to tell God what to do, what's right, what we think is good. So it's okay for us to go and commit all these terrible things, sins, and yeah, we're okay. No. So there's a lot of bad things going on with Absalom, hypocritical things.
Yeah.
So
Good observation on Absalom's actions here, that he's suddenly so concerned about justice in his little facade he's putting up here. But he wasn't concerned about justice with when he killed Amnon, or for how he needed to be dealt with when he really should have been put to death. No, this is him being double-tongued, really. Lita?
Yeah, in any case in the world, anywhere, 99.9% of impersonating somebody, that means the guy or whoever it is has an immediate agenda, which can, as the word says, steal the hearts of the people.
Yeah.
We have seen it in the past, politically, economically, and financially. One thing that is for sure is when someone impersonates something or someone, there is a hidden agenda which that 0.1% that is remaining on the 99.9% will be
Yeah.
the outcome of 99.9% is not good.
Yeah, absolutely. Say one thing about Absalom here, in that you might think he's impulsive, but I don't really think he is. Like, he's taken some very drastic actions, but they've not been done quickly. When he killed Amnon, it was years later. When he started his rebellion, he let this build up over years. When he dramatically got Joab's attention, it was after years of things building up. Absalom does not react there just in that moment of when he feels something. In some ways, he's done something worse. He's let the evil build up. He's let the sin build up and his sinful attitudes build up, and until he's concocted a very careful plan to be able to do what he wants to do very well. And so he's been successful in his schemes. He was successful in killing Amnon. He leads a pretty successful rebellion here, at least for a time. But yeah, go ahead, Jeff.
What you were saying earlier, thou shalt not steal. It's one of the things, one of the commandments and stuff. He took something that did not belong to him. Was not supposed to be his, stuff, but he took it. He did. Like I said, it was supposed to be to their hearts was supposed to be to God and to their king. But like I said, he took it away.
People who work behind the scenes or in the open to undermine the authority of those who have authority are not pleasing to God. whatever that authority is. That's true with kings, that's true with governments, that's true with elders in a church, it's true anytime there's authority. With this working behind the scenes to undermine authority is not indicative of a heart that seeks God. All right, thanks everyone. Next week we will pick up in verse 7 with Absalom's open rebellion, see how all this unfolds.